Hello everyone, and welcome back to COSS, our course on commercial open source software startups and how to spin them out of university. My name is Dirk Riele, and I'm teaching this course with Dr. Thomas Otter. So today we will be talking about software vendors. We previously talked about products, but we need to talk about vendors now, as those who actually bring a product to market. We will have to contrast software product firms, said vendors, with project firms, consulting firms. And to understand the differences, we need to take a look at the financials of it and how they play out for these very different types of companies. And then for software vendors, we will also look at the key business functions, the roles or positions the roles people play and the positions they hold, and then the core business processes that constitute the business of a software vendor. So in the previous sessions, we already talked about the main players of the software industry, as well as what products are. We will focus here on that particularly interesting type of industry player called a software vendor, because that's where startups or product startups are made from, that have that Silicon Valley cachet of possibly being large and successful companies based on, software products. The key is software vendors provide you with so-called standardized software or commercial off-the-shelf software, meaning one product for a market, as opposed to custom-made products for individual customers. There are two variants. The classic software vendor is the producer of the software, and in addition, we have seen these days that there's also the provision of that product, not as a traditional license sale any longer, but as a service, meaning software as a service, meaning the cloud service providers or internet companies. These are standard product providers, and we will look at software vendors, also at cloud computing firms. In both cases, it's always a product for a market, not a custom-made product for a single customer. And when we look at what is a product, we previously discussed how we can structure a product into these different components, how these different extension stages of a product correspond with customer groups. So we know that there needs to be some sort of core product. Later we'll see how that is also called in the startup context a minimum viable product, and how a growing company extends that or builds that out into a basic product with more functionality, that a broader array of customer needs, all the way to a whole product with all the bells and whistles needed by large enterprises who are often reluctant to buy unless every item on some checklist is met. So then, first, products versus projects and product firms versus project firms. So we already saw that in a previous lecture, how, say, SAP needs consulting firms to put their product into action, because the product as a standardized product as a commercial off-the-shelf software is just too generic to satisfy the needs of a particular customer. And this complementarity will be with us today for the whole lecture, because for enterprise software, this is almost always the case. There is just no enterprise software that is so good that you don't need to customize it and adjust it. And that usually leads to a separation of work between a software vendor who provides a standardized product and a consulting firm which, in the course of a project paid for by a customer project, turns that standardized software to specific software for that for that one customer. The main difference, or the main thing to realize, is that this is how it is in the enterprise software market, but that in the consumer space or retail space, the consumers are usually so price sensitive that they would hate to have to pay for an expensive additional consulting project. They are either willing to put in the time themselves, or they simply assume that the software has to work out of the box, which means that the vendor has to make it work out of the box for them most of the time. And this has profound implications on who earns how much money. Software products in the traditional context, by a traditional software vendor 20 years ago, would create revenue of two types. The first piece of revenue was the initial one-time license fee. A salesperson succeeded in closing a deal with a customer, or some company who then became a customer. And for that initial deal closing, for that first year of providing the software, the user tries to use the software, the license, for that first year, there was a comparatively high initial license fee to be paid. And come year 2, that customer would not be willing to pay that same initial license fee again. They would want to pay so-called maintenance fees, which generally hover around 15 to 20, 25, sometimes 30% of the initial fee. Usually you can assume it's 20% of the initial fee. It's still a great deal for the vendor because they don't have to close a deal again. An established customer is likely to stick around, and that means you don't have so-called customer acquisition costs, about we will talk later. But for now, you see you have this initial gain and then a much lower but steady maintenance fee that customers pay. And the nice thing is that if you close one deal in the first year, and a second deal in the second year, and a third one in the third year, and so forth, the maintenance revenue is actually what makes you a successful business over time. Because it keeps piling up. Once you have that customer and they don't leave, you have this guaranteed stream of income, and it is the base from which you can feed your company and the costs. And the initial license fee is only a one-time fee, but it's the maintenance revenue that keeps piling up and makes being a software vendor so nice. This is still the case today, even if you are providing a cloud service where we don't talk about maintenance revenue any longer, but rather about subscription revenue. In this case, the revenue for the vendor is such that there is no initial license fee. That's bad, if you will. So there's not that initial hump of, wow, we made a deal and now we get a lot of money in the first year. But rather it is just a steady subscription fee. If the customer doesn't change their plan, that's just the fee they pay every year. The good thing is, like maintenance revenue, it is revenue that comes in every year if the customer doesn't leave. So it has that exact same nice property of it keeps piling up and makes your life as a vendor very nice. On top of that, because in subscription to a cloud service, at least if it's a cloud service that the customers are subscribing to, the actual revenue is higher than the maintenance fee. After all, you have to do more as a vendor because now you're operating the software for your customers in the cloud. And so you actually make more every year on a single customer. You have higher costs, but obviously you will want to structure it in such a way that you make more revenue of the additional service that you are providing. So that's how software vendors who provide a standardized product to a market work. Now software projects, on the other hand. A project is an undertaking with a defined start and a defined end. It's not a product. It's a project is or has a process with defined start and end date, while a product has no end date usually. So a software project then is such form of project. And the key thing to understand is that in a project, the customer is almost always paying for some piece of work that's specific to them, hence a project rather than a product. And so in some form or another, what the customer is paying for is labor. Labor means people applied over time. Even if the provider of a software project, the consulting firm, is offering a fixed price, they will have priced in the actual labor it will cost them. So given a project, the cost to the customer and the revenues to the project provider, consulting firm, always strongly correlates with the actual labor put in. And so this is also then the fee for a project is the revenue, and then the labor costs are the expenses of the consulting firm. And so you know your projects very well. Your bachelor or master thesis is a project, has a start and has an end date, hopefully. But in the software world, more often, again, it's like customizing SAP for a customer. That would be a project, while SAP's business suite would be the product. So that means the flow of money, the revenues, is quite different for a consulting firm. If you're a consulting firm which does software projects, you charge your customers the fee for the project, and that fee is due somehow close in time to the actual project. And once the project is over and the fees have been paid, that's it. There's no maintenance revenue. There's no piling up of something here. It is money for labor, and once no labor is being provided, the money goes away. The actual amount of money being paid is pretty nice. It's usually much higher than a software license fee, and certainly the maintenance fees, simply because, well, that's the cost of labor. While in the fees for a software product, unless it's really a monopolist who can charge you whatever they want, the fees for a product are usually such that they are much lower than the actual labor that went into developing the product, and these costs, the labor costs, are being recouped over time by selling the same product to many different customers. For a consulting firm, charging one customer the fees for one project, that's the only time they get money for that labor. So the fees for a project are much higher than the cost of purchasing a license for a product. In the SAP case, enterprise software case, it's a factor easily of 5 to 10 more that the customer is charged for the implementation project than the actual license. But the vendor makes up for it with the maintenance revenue in year 2 and 3 and 4, where the consulting firm makes no money. What the consulting firm does is sell another project for the second year and yet another one for the third year. So if a consulting firm sells a project and carries it out after another, they have a steady revenue based on the number of people they have and whose labor they can sell to customers. As you can see, it's significant income, revenues here, but it's steady over time. If you don't hire more people and sell more projects, you will not have revenue growth. You'll just have steady revenues like this at a high level, but they are steady. They don't keep growing like the software vendors did. So here you can see it side by side. The project revenues in the first year are higher than a single license sale of a product, but over time the product revenue keeps catching up based on that socket or the base from the piling up of the maintenance or subscription revenue. While the revenues of selling the same project over and over with the same labor force simply stay the same. So you may think, wouldn't everyone want to be a software vendor then? Why would anyone want to be a consulting firm? Well, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. The software vendor has these nice increasing revenues if they're doing things right. It's predictable because customers who are locked in don't easily leave. And it makes for a nice valuation in the stock market and hence makes it good companies. They're hard to get started though because you need to make it to that software in the first place, which requires upfront investment. And it's not guaranteed that you succeed in developing that software. It's not guaranteed that you succeed in really meeting customer and market requirements. It's not guaranteed that you win against competitors in competitive sales situations and gain those customers that give you that nice piling up revenue. So many software vendors, startups who want to be software vendors fail and few survive. Those who survive are the legends that are the highly successful companies we all depend on these days. Consulting firms, in contrast, are not capital intensive. They can be started easily. It's you and a couple of friends renting out your time, meaning charging someone for the labor you provide. So pricing is comparatively simple because of that. You know how many people maybe are needed for a project and you charge your customers for that. There's a higher volatility if customers don't have the money because they have an economic downturn or they want to save money. Consulting projects are usually the first to go. And scaling up such a business is also harder because you need to hire more people. That's the main way of scaling up a consulting firm. And people are harder, good people, capable people are harder to get and keep than, say, selling a successful product one more time. So I want to take a look now at the financials of these companies so that you get a feeling for how software vendors work or how to think about their financial side. There are three basic documents in financial statements in accounting. There's the balance sheet, which shows you all the assets you have, all the liabilities, things you have to pay, and then your equity. It's usually not so important for the operations to understand the operations of a software vendor. Then there's the income statement, which shows for a given year how much money was made and what the costs for that were, so revenues and expenses. And it gives you a high-level overview, all the way down into the details if you need to, but it gives you that overview of how you are doing because so the income statement is usually the most important statement to understand a successful software vendor. Separate from the income statement, there's the cash flow statement. We won't discuss those. The cash flow statement looks at the actual money in the bank or the actual money that came and left. And that is different from revenues and expenses in the income statement because the income statement is a logical view. You make a deal, you make a sale, and so you put on your books that you expect the payments from a customer. Except that sometimes they don't come. The customer may have had a 60-day period of paying and in the meantime they went bankrupt. Or they got your product and you put down the sales price, but they disagree with the performance of the product and become tricky, don't want to pay full, want to renegotiate, whatever. So a lot of things can happen between what you put down in the accounting books, which becomes part of your income statement, and when the money is actually in the bank or is leaving the bank as you pay your salaries. The latter is the cash flow statement. We will look at the income statement mostly. So I have used these terms, so let me be more precise. These terms meaning revenues, expenses, and profits. If you have a bit of a business background, you should know that. Revenues is the income or the money you make from customers, so sales, income, etc. Expenses are basically the costs you have. There are very different forms of expenses. Most notably, of course, the salaries you pay, might also be computers you operate, commissions you pay, all kinds of things. And profit then is the difference between the incoming money and the outgoing money, the revenues and the expenses. So if you want to know whether some company is profitable, you subtract all the expenses from the revenues, and if it's a positive number, it's profitable in that time period, and if it's a negative number, it is losing money. The company is losing money. Time periods where you look at this is usually the year, but also the quarter, of course, at which financials people take a look. So here's an example income statement of Facebook, I think, maybe 10 years old or so, well, 2011, so nearly 10 years old. And you can see in absolute numbers, but also then translated into percentages, how the revenue, the income from sales goes down as expenses are being subtracted all the way to, in this case, actually a profit, here an operating profit. So the way to read these statements is at the top you have the incoming money, the revenues usually. Sometimes you have it broken down. So here you can see that the basic subscription and support is the main driver of revenues, 94% of the revenue. But then there's something called professional services, which we'll also look at, which adds a small piece to the revenue. The cost of revenues, or the expenses, the direct expenses as they are related to providing subscription and support and professional services. So directly related to that, so-called variable expenses are listed here as well, and they are about 20% of the revenues. And as you break it down further, you discover more types of expenses or costs to a business. Now there are the operating expenses, which is important to understand for a vendor. Operating expenses are those that are not tied to satisfying a specific customer. They are not variable, if you will. They are fixed costs in that you simply have these costs for research and development. Whether you have one customer more or less usually doesn't change your head count in research and development. When you look at the operating expenses here, you can see how research and development, shockingly for an engineer like me, is not the majority of expenses. Rather, sales and marketing are substantially higher, 5 times as much as research and development, and that is not uncommon. There's even general and administrative, whatever, renting buildings or so, I assume might be in there, and just other stuff that is maybe the salaries of the HR department is also not to be neglected. In this case, Facebook actually turns a profit, so it's not a loss. Here is a fun quiz provided by Dr. Otter. How about we take a look at 2 very different companies. Accenture, the large consulting firm in the software industry, and Salesforce, as software as a service company. I think the original, they coined the term software as a service. And here we can see some key data from their 2019 income statement, for example, the revenue, and then the net income, meaning the revenue after pretty much everything was subtracted, so that would be profit or loss. So the revenues of Accenture are much higher than those of Salesforce, or were much higher than those of Salesforce in 2019. Revenues in general, the more the better. There's almost no reason not to want to have more revenues. And as you can see, the profits of Accenture is pretty nice, about 10% of the revenue, while Salesforce has a much lower profit, close to zero profit. Profit can change from year to year based on how you invest your money, meaning you could have very different investments. So Salesforce actually in the year before and year thereafter turned more of a profit than in this particular year. In that particular year, into the books, and made extra investments, made it into the books, which pushed down their profits. Salesforce has been around for 20 years now, so they're definitely a profitable company. So the interesting question here is to ask, what does the stock market think about these companies? Whose stock would you rather own, or which company would you rather own? Could say, well, 43 billion versus 17 billion, higher profitability with Accenture rather than Salesforce. Obviously Accenture, or not. So we'll see in the slide. What else is noteworthy to see here is perhaps to take a look at the number of employees. That's also important. You can see that Accenture has 10 times as many employees as Salesforce. That already should be impressive, given then with 10 times more employees, Accenture is not creating 10 times more revenue. So definitely the power of a single employee at Salesforce is higher than that at Accenture. So what do you think? Or maybe hold your breath, or stop here for a second and wonder what would be the market capitalization of Accenture versus Salesforce before I turn the leaf to the next slide. So in 2019, they were nearly the same. So the stock market as a whole thought these are equivalently priced companies, and they would create the same return for the investor. The value for Salesforce actually has gone up significantly. It's also a bit more volatile. And so the interesting thing is to see the price to sales ratio, meaning the factor that lets you go from the revenues, so the money being made, to the market capitalization. So multiple here, and you can see that for every dollar Salesforce makes, the stock market values it at higher, more than twice as high than for Accenture. So they so stock market investors look at the revenue for Accenture and say, well, so it's times 4 roughly to get to the total value of the company, while it's times 9 for Salesforce. So there's a much higher leverage that a software vendor or a software as a service company like Salesforce has. Meaning also your own stock, if you were an initial investor or an early employee, has a much higher lever than for a consulting company. Not to mention again that a 500,000 person company like Accenture needed much more time to be built up to reach these numbers, and is much more of a tanker than the certainly not small Salesforce with 50,000 employees. All of this goes to my point that unless you really are a consulting person, software vendors tend to be the nicer or more attractive businesses, and we saw that in the comparison where we noted that software vendors are the type of companies that gets venture capital investments, while consulting firms are those who don't. So now I will look at how software vendors are structured, and for that we will look at both business functions first and then the key processes that constitute the business of a software vendor. So a business function is the role or the position that companies have that defines their job, like being a salespeople or being a marketing person or marketeer, etc. So that's what you usually call the business function, the type of activities grouped by a set of skills you need to be able to successfully carry out those activities. And in one way or another, you have heard about how companies have these different departments, which like sales and marketing, which could be broken down further like sales, marketing, customer success, and so forth. Engineering, definitely for a SaaS company, cloud service providers as development, but also operations and support and so forth. There's HR and finance. All of these are business functions. Next to the business functions, we need processes. And the distinguishing characteristic is that these processes are cross-functional, meaning they tie together as workflows they tie together multiple business functions typically. So for example, building the product in the first place, that requires product management to work with development and operations, and usually also finance, as you need the money, the budget to build the product. Operating it needs development, operations, and support. Selling your product, acquiring customers needs sales and marketing and product management to work hand in hand to be successful. You may wonder why companies are not structured around processes. Why is it functions? I think in this traditional view here, it's a hierarchical view of business function based on the skills and capabilities people have to bring to the table to be employed in those business functions. I think these roles and positions are more stable than the business processes, and the underlying workflows, they keep changing. But sure enough, and outside the scope really of this course, there are different ways of organizing companies. This here is the very classic hierarchical business function-oriented view with the implied line reporting, managerial relationship between subordinate and superior. But some companies have a matrix structure, for example, where you overlay projects on top of this hierarchical structure and so forth. This is for this you need to go to have a separate business course. But here I want to look at it. What do you do in a software vendor company, a software vendor? So perhaps the most important, well, that's my opinion because I like it so much, but perhaps one of the most important business functions is product management. The top job in software product management at a company is often called the Chief Product Officer, sometimes Vice President of Product, but increasingly it has the C-level CPO title, and that's pretty nice. You can distinguish, it's also outside the scope really of this course, but would be discussed in a full-blown product management course. You can distinguish between a strategic product manager who thinks more about the market and positioning the product and who to partner with and all of that. And a technical product manager who's in the details of satisfying or understanding customer needs and communicating them to the engineering team so that they are implemented right. It's not a perfect match, but a technical product manager is close to what in Agile methods or in Scrum you would call a product owner, at least an empowered product owner. What they do is the strategic product manager identifies new business opportunities and justifies the budget to go after them. They define the product vision for that opportunity, lay out a roadmap, define features all the way down to the nitty-gritty work of a technical product manager. And they are really key for building the product and acquiring customers and even ensuring customer satisfaction. A product manager is really central for a lot of things, and a product manager has to be a highly communicative person for that reason, because they talk to a lot of people. They often do not have pure organizational power. They don't necessarily have a lot of people reporting to them. A good product manager cajoles or convinces people that their suggested choice of action, their plan is the right thing to do. But they usually don't have the people power to actually carry it out. The people with the large staff or head count, that's usually the engineering manager or the sales side of things. So here's the engineering side or software development. So there are different roles and titles. So there's the regular developer or engineer. Sometimes you have a software architect, that is someone who probably used to be an engineer but now has more oversight about how pieces fit together. So they are responsible for the software architecture, and that is a technical responsibility, making sure that the pieces fit together. And then there are, on the people side, the engineering managers who are responsible for, as the human resources speak goes, the resources, meaning the engineers, to put them to use, to assign them, to allocate tasks to them in classic development, or getting their back in more agile development. So what you do in development is you design, build, and evolve that product that brings in the money. You're also involved in third-level support. So if everything goes wrong and the customer is desperate and nothing's working, then that escalates to the developers as serious bugs usually. So what they do is they build the product. In cloud service providers and cloud computing companies, we also have operations, as we are operating the software for customers. And there are necessarily operations managers and operators. There are site reliability engineers. That's a fairly recent development. Well, not so recent, make it 20 years, but responsible for ensuring that the service, the sites, the websites, the services are up and running reliably. And their job is to operate that service, including sometimes third-level support like engineers itself. Support. Every company needs support, so that where support is to help the customer use the product right. Support is reactive usually, in that customers come with an issue, something's not working, and that's then when support engineers and the managers jump into action. They get support requests, this is not working, that is not working, something broke down, and they will look into it and hopefully provide solutions, fixes to customers. That was the engineering side of things. Now on the sales and marketing side, first we have marketing. So there's the marketing people, or marketeers sometimes, and the managers. And obviously they want the market to know about their products, about your products. So all the way from bringing an individual product to market to creating broad brand awareness as an umbrella or as about your company and as an umbrella maybe for your whole product suite or portfolio, they make people aware of you. They actually are supposed to generate demand. That's the key thing. They are supposed to stuff what we will see in a few slides is the so-called sales funnel, where they find people who might be customers, stick it in there, and hopefully come out at the other end. Real customers, paying customers. And so they help, ultimately their goal is to help acquire customers. The actual people who close the deal are the salespeople, of course. So they're sales reps or salespeople, need support with pre-sales people. If it's a technical product, you often need to really demonstrate more deeply on a technical level what the product can, and often a salesperson can't do that, so you need a pre-sales engineer to do that, who goes out to customer visits or customer sites with the actual salesperson, your sales managers, etc. Sales management is very different from actual selling. These are quite different skill sets. There's also the term account manager, which relates to a person who is watching, who is a salesperson, who is watching a large account, where a large account means a customer, a long-time customer with substantial budget to spend, where you've been selling perhaps many different aspects of your product to them. And because these customers are big and important, they need to be managed particularly well, and that's what account managers are for. And so salespeople turn qualified leads, which they receive from marketing, they turn them into customers. And so that's the initial sell, and then they drive upsell or try to drive upsell, meaning an existing customer buys a little more, buys the more expensive product, buys more functionality, hence more revenue for the vendor, or cross-sell, sells a different product that's related, but because they already are a customer, they like that other product as well from your portfolio, etc. So salespeople obviously help you acquire the customers for you. Then in software vendors, there is customer success. It's one thing to close a deal, and then usually a salesperson is satisfied. They probably earned a commission and they are very happy. But from the vendor's perspective, from the company's perspective, they want that customer to stay a happy customer. And surprisingly enough, closing a deal but then making the software work really well for the customer is not one and the same thing. Rather, you need to make sure that your customers actually succeed in putting the product to use. It's not unheard of, actually it's rather common that products are bought and never used. And then as customers use the software, they may not be that good at using it, and they are using it the wrong way, and they are never satisfied, and hence they might drop off. So customer success proactively, unlike support, which is reactive, customer success proactively tries to help customers succeed in using your product so that they are happy customers. So that, for example, upsells and cross-sells become possible for your sales department. And so that the customers stick around and renew and renew and renew and so forth, so that the so-called churn, meaning those who drop out, is low. That's what you need customer success for. Professional services is another services function, or is, if you will, the consulting arm of a software vendor. So that may now sound surprising at first. Why am I saying consulting arm if a vendor is a vendor and consulting firms are consulting firms? Well, that is correct. SAP, for example, collaborates with a lot of consulting firms who implement SAP for customers. But SAP also has a small consulting arm. And the reason here is that these vendor internal consulting arms are critical in gathering information on how well implementation projects work. So they are like regular consultants. They even compete with actual outside consulting firms. But a vendor typically keeps it low key and does not try to compete big time with the other consulting firms. But they do still need this consulting arm to learn about the specifics of how well their product, their enterprise software then usually actually works for customers and how easy it is to implement them, etc. At the same time, so you need to understand these implementation processes, the customization processes, because the real consulting firms are your partners. You need to understand what they're doing. You need to be able to evaluate them. For example, you may want to kick someone out, some consulting firm who's doing shoddy work and who's hurting your reputation, etc. So they are professional services firms, are key stakeholders in ensuring customer satisfaction, but they also feed into product management and making the product right for a market and the customers inside. All right, and then there's human resources. Super important to have the right people, but not specific to software vendors as much. Well, that's not necessarily true. Hiring is a non-trivial process, but human resources only supports hiring. Usually the hiring decision is made by, say, an engineering or sales manager. Finance, of course, always also important. In helping fundraising if necessary, managing the books, ensuring compliance, all of that. So this also simply belongs to a successful and complete company. And this can get quite large. So Thomas Otter found this here, Dr. Otter found this old IBM, back then still called the tabulating machine company, structure of a company, so very hierarchical, but you can see even 100 years ago there was separate a sales department from a systems department and a manufacturing department, and there was something called office, basically back office, I assume, and so forth. So detail-oriented, hierarchical, that's how it used to be in 1917. And as you saw a couple of slides ago, that hierarchical structure is still around and still pretty dominant in many respects. It's not the only view of looking at a company structure, but still an important one. So, as you might be thinking about, who am I in this whole picture? Here are the titles to understand which career path you might be on. As an engineering student, you can typically become a developer, so you join development inside a software vendor, and there you can have a technical or a managerial career. If you're a developer and you're just happy you're a developer, nothing wrong with that. If you want to have a managerial career, then you can become an engineering manager, and at the top that's usually called the vice president of engineering, to who the other engineering managers report, etc. A technical career, as a developer, you might become a software architect, having more oversight and decision rights on the overall technical structure of products. And at the top of a software architecture is usually the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer. In the US, there's a very clear distinction in, say, a Silicon Valley company between a VP of engineering who is a people person, a manager of people, and a CTO who is a technical person, also has staff, but much less than a VP of engineering, and is concerned with the technical aspects of the product. In Germany, still these two titles are confounded and put into one. And because CTO sounds nicer, it's usually just a CTO present, and that CTO is both a VP of engineering, so he or she has to manage all the staff, and also then is still responsible for the architecture, which, as you might guess, as soon as there's some size involved or complexity involved, doesn't really work well. So under these circumstances, then the CTO quickly is just the wrong title, but is actually a vice president of engineering, managing people, and delegates the actual technical considerations to separate architects. Engineering students can also become product managers. And if you are a product manager, you could usually upgrade to, you start maybe as a technical product manager, and you could upgrade to a strategic product manager and ultimately a chief product officer. So these are the common terms that people use. If you're coming from the business side, you can also become a product manager and make your way there, or you can go into sales and marketing. Whether it's better to start as a business student or an engineering student and get into a high-tech startup is unclear. The more technical the product, the harder it is for the business student to really understand the product, and so they will do well probably in sales and marketing, but not necessarily in product management. The learning curve with a business background to learn about the technical domain is much harder and higher than if you are an engineering student with sufficient technical background to understand the product, and now to become a product manager, you're picking up the business side of things. So the more technical the products and the vendor, the more likely you're better served starting out as an engineering student if you want to get into product management. All right, and now we just talked about the business functions and the kind of activities and capabilities and what they do and what posts and positions they hold. Now I want to talk a little about the key processes that make a software vendor tick, make a software vendor work well. And when I say key processes, then it's those processes that help make money, which is important to understand from a career perspective, because usually you want to be in a position where your work helps the company make money as opposed to save money or just support the operations of the company. Almost always, if you bring in money, you're better positioned within the company to have a career than not. So for example, if you work for a bank, it's much better to be a banker than an IT person in banking, because as an IT person, you're considered a so-called cost center. You cost money, you're definitely needed, and you may have a nice salary, but you're never going to become the CEO of the company simply because it's a bank and the CEO will always be a banker. So only in software vendors can software engineers possibly become CEOs. We talked about it already. Here's a stratified, simplified, with all the right terms, hierarchical managerial structure. So again, it's the classic line reporting hierarchy with the different departments and the types of people who run them. And so you can look at this and you can see how the CEO, of course, is at the top of the food chain, and how there's a struggle, if you will, for so-called C-level positions. There's a CRO, CTO, chief CHRO, Chief Human Resources Officer, CFO, financial guy, person, and so forth. So in terms of processes, these are the processes that ensure you're making money. So these are key for the vendor to thrive, not just to survive, but to thrive. Building the product, acquiring customers, operating the product, supporting customers, and ensuring customer satisfaction, meaning they actually do get out of it what they intended to get out of it. So product development, again, is an interaction of product management with engineering and support by finance and HR. Product managers are structured in a larger situation, if there's more than one product manager, into strategic product manager who defined or is responsible for meeting the market opportunity, and who delegates or coordinates to technical product managers who are responsible for the detailed specification or requirements. There is not a lot of line reporting and product management here, really. Usually there's one product manager for every 10 or 20 engineers. So if you're a startup, there will be one product manager, and often it's only a part-time product manager because they also have another C-level role also inside the company. Engineering is where the headcount is, where there is an engineering manager with multiple developers reporting to them, and that's how you build the product. On the sales side, there is the so-called, more formally, not just selling, there's the customer acquisition process. Obviously, it's critical for this to work, so you're selling, you're closing deals and have revenues. And here, the concept of the sales funnel comes into play. The sales funnel is exactly this customer acquisition process, or a visualization of that process, where customers go through different stages, where in the beginning they just barely got aware of your product, so awareness has been raised, and where at the end, if they are still there, they actually sign the deal and buy the product. And this customer acquisition process has stages that are well defined, well understood, and are supported by different activities, which are carried out by different people. The initial stages or phases of the sales funnel, awareness and discovery, are managed and driven forward by marketing people. So it's marketeers or marketing people who raise awareness of your product in the market, who bring it in front of the eyes of potential customers, so not yet customers, potential customers, who are then fed into this funnel. So it's a funnel because of the form. And once they're in there, they are called leads. So potential customers are called leads because we don't know whether they will make it all the way to the end. As you can see, the sales funnel narrows, hence there is leads dropping out. So marketing is responsible for the first two stages in this illustration of the sales funnel, and salespeople, sales representatives, are responsible for the last three stages. There are different depictions of the funnel, and we will revisit that, and sometimes it's only 4, sometimes it's 6 stages. The key is always the same. The initial steps are taken and supported by marketing, and the remainder is done by salespeople who drive the deal at the end. So salespeople guide leads to become customers through an evaluation to the actual buying of the product. Product managers are important here too, because product managers inform marketing managers about what's coming down the road. Marketing managers need something to work with. If they don't know what to communicate, they can't communicate anything sensible. Hence, they need to talk to product managers to learn what is in the making, what is the product about, what can we tell customers, how does it meet customer needs, etc., before they turn that into a message they get out to the market. As you have a product in the cloud, potentially, you need to operate it. And for that, software development works with operations. So these are different departments, dev and ops. Development develops the product, and operations are separate people. But to make it reliable, you need to have this hybrid job of the site reliability engineer. So they need to communicate. Product managers, not shown here, figure in as well, of course, because reliability needs to be defined. To what level is that important to customers, and so forth. And also support needs to support customers as they use the operated software, so they're also relevant here. Customer support is what customers pay for. They pay a subscription, and most certainly support is in that subscription, meaning support learns from product management what type of support is being sold and they can provide, and how to provide it is their thing, of course, and so they react to any incoming support request by customers. They need to work with development and operations in case something goes wrong, so sometimes support requests have to be escalated as serious bugs to development and operations. And then, as discussed previously, but important to reiterate perhaps, if a customer buys, it doesn't mean they become a happy customer instantaneously. Rather, there's still steps to take, because until the product is in good use, in proper use, in successful use with a customer, until you reach that stage, a lot of things can go wrong in between. So that's customer success, who proactively try to work with customers to make sure that what they just purchased is actually used, what they just purchased and are using is used right, is used correctly, and is set up in such a way that it actually helps the customer achieve their business goal, why they bought the software in the first place. And without customer success, you would have lots of failed purchases and unhappy customers, and hence ultimately no renewals, none of that nice piling up of revenue over time by happy, satisfied, and locked in customers. So with that, I'm at the end of giving you a short overview of what a software vendor does. It's important to understand again that vendors go sell standardized products or offer a standardized service based on a product, as opposed to doing custom projects for specific customers. This has a lot of financial consequences. It's usually much nicer to be a software vendor where with a much lower head count you can acquire revenue, because selling that one additional product license is so much easier than selling another consulting project, and is so much nicer and easier to scale. So all of the expenses are moved. So most of the expenses of a consulting firms are in the labor of the actual projects, while more of the expenses for a software vendor are in the general part, and not in the delivery of the product to a specific customer part of the expenses. Then we looked at the business functions and the core business processes, and we will revisit some of them in more detail in the next lecture on the business model underlying the software vendor. And so let me say thank you for your time and attention, and see you in the next lecture.